In the first scene, we see a girl trying to do suicide, hanging herself with a rope in a house. On the outside wall of the house, a word named bruja was written, which means witch in Spanish. Some boys are screaming bruja and throwing stones at the house. Then we see a shadow entity attack her, and the chair that she is standing on also falls and she probably dies. Then the scene changes and shows a blind lady walking on a road. Her name is Sydney and she lost her sight when she was 5 years old. In the next scene, we get to know that she is a professional lead violinist and she is playing violin with the group because they are going to play in a concert. In the next scene, Sydney comes to the hotel room, and a man named Miguel, who is basically the hotel manager, helps her get to the elevator. He then asks her if she is nervous about tomorrow because the next day, she had the cornea transplant surgery. She says that she is so scared, and the Miguel gives her some encouragement and says good luck. Then she gets a voicemail from her sister Helen, and we get to know that her sister is also coming to the hospital tomorrow. In the next scene, Sydney is lying on the hospital bed covering her eyes with bandages. Her surgery has gone successfully. We see an old lady wearing an oxygen mask on her next bed with difficulty breathing. Then a 9-year-old girl named Alicia comes to Sydney and talks to her. Alicia tells Sydney that she has a golf ball thing inside her head, which means she has a brain tumor. In the next scene, we see the doctor takes the bandages off from Sydney's eyes. Sydney's sister is also with her. When she opens her eyes, she sees everything blurry. She tells the doctor that she has a little discomfort in her eyes, and the doctor says it's completely normal and checks her eyes. Then she sees a blurry shadow-like figure standing beside her sister and then moves away. But in reality, no one was there. In the next scene, Sydney and her sister Helen are talking. Helen apologizes to Sydney because in childhood, Sydney lost her sight because of her. They were playing with firecrackers. Their parents are dead, and Helen says to Sydney that she wishes they could see Sydney with her vision back. Sydney tells Helen that it's not her fault and she loves her. Sydney was sleeping in her hospital bed. Then Alicia came to her. Alicia asks Sydney if she can see her. Sydney asks Alicia what's she wearing in her head. Alicia says it's a bandana and her grandpa gave it to her. Alicia tells Sydney that she will take Sydney for a walk outside tomorrow. Then a nurse sees Alicia and Alicia goes to her bed. That night, Sydney sees that same shadow-like entity comes to the old lady next to her bed, and the old woman says that she doesn't want to go. But that entity takes her out of the room. Sydney follows them, but she doesn't see anyone. Then she hears a voice in the distance. Someone is standing in the hallway and it looks like the old lady. Sydney doesn't see properly because of her blurry vision. Sydney thinks it is her and she walks slowly to her. Suddenly someone appears behind Sydney, moving around her and making some weird sounds. Then suddenly it stops in front of Sydney, comes to her, and says, "I'm freezing." Sydney gets afraid and unable to help herself. Then some feet of distance from her, that entity disappears. On the next morning, the hospital staff is cleaning the bed of that old lady. Sydney asks them why they are cleaning, and they say that she passed away last night. In the next scene, the doctor checks Sydney's eyes and tells her everything is normal. Then Sydney asks the doctor about the donor of her eyes. The doctor tells her that he can't help with that. Sydney also asks the doctor when she can see clearly. Then the doctor says it depends from patient to patient and it may take a couple of days to a couple of weeks. Then he refers her to an eye specialist named Paul. In her room, Sydney tries to see herself in the mirror and does some facial expressions, but she sees herself blurry in the mirror. The next day, Sydney is discharged from the hospital. Sydney says Alicia goodbye and takes a picture with her. Alicia tells Sydney not to be afraid because the world is very beautiful. Helen takes Sydney to the hotel in her car. That night, Sydney sees a vision of someone burning on fire in her kitchen. She wakes up and then sees that her room is changing in front of her. She doesn't understand what is going on. In the next scene, Sydney is at Paul's office. Dr. Paul tells her that there is no issue with her eyes after seeing her previous report, but he tells her that now her brain might take some time to adapt to this new world, so she can't fully trust her vision. And he's going to help her. In the next scene, Sydney is studying her violin notes, and then she hears a voice outside of her room. She sees a shadow of someone walking past her room. She goes outside her room to check. But she doesn't see anything, and when she turns back, she sees a little boy wearing a raincoat and asks Sydney if she sees his report card. Sydney asks him if he lives here. Then suddenly the boy disappears. In the next scene, Sydney is playing violin in a recording studio. But she can't concentrate on the violin, and the conductor takes her to a restaurant for a coffee and gives her some advice and encouragement for their upcoming concert. Then the conductor goes to take the order. Sydney then sees a woman talking in her direction and says, "You think I'm just going to let you go? And I'm going to do it." Sydney looks back with confusion to see if the woman is talking to somebody else behind her. But no one sees the woman. When Sydney looks again at that woman, she is gone. Sydney sees her surroundings, and then suddenly that woman attacks Sydney and then vanishes. Sydney jumps out of her chair, collides with a waiter, and falls to the ground. She is so shocked and doesn't know what just happened, and she leaves the restaurant with confusion and fear. On that night, she again sees a terrifying vision of people dying on fire. When she wakes up, her room changes again. On the floor, she sees an old chair and a hanging rope from the ceiling. When she gets closer to touching the walls, the chair falls as if someone threw it, and then everything goes back to normal. On the next day, Sydney goes to Paul's to tell him about all the abnormal things that are happening to her. But Paul doesn't believe her. That night Sydney is watching TV, and then suddenly the room is covered with smoke, and the smoke comes from the outside. She looks through the peephole. She sees a shadow entity standing outside. Suddenly someone knocks on the door and says, "Open the door." She gets afraid and moves away from the door. Her room is now fully covered by smoke. She is choking and trying to breathe. She then enters a room of fire, and she again sees people dying in fire. Then a man on fire grabs her arm and her arm burns. She wakes up from that vision, realizing that she slept on the sofa and the TV is still turned on. Everything's normal now, but she notices that the burning signs are still on her hand that gradually fade away. Sydney is so afraid by now and rushes through the road and calls her sister Helen. But the call goes to her voicemail. While crossing the road, a girl walks right through her. They both are so shocked. At some distance, Sydney hears some noises saying, "Call 911, and Sydney goes to look at what's happening there. Sydney finds that a girl was hit by a car and died. Interestingly, this is the same girl who just walked right through Sydney. Sydney looks back to see the soul of the girl. Sydney sees that her soul has been taken by the shadow entity, and they both disappear. Sydney then goes to a Chinese restaurant and calls Paul to come there. Then she sees another vision of that Chinese restaurant blowing up with fire. The restaurant is destroyed. Then Paul comes there. She explains what just happened, but Paul says that the restaurant caught fire a week ago and 5 people were killed. It was in the newspaper. Then Sydney explains to Paul everything that has been happening with her. She tells the shadow. She says it is kind of an escort that takes people away when they're dead. She tells Paul that she's seeing things that aren't real. But Paul again refuses to believe in her stories, and he tells her that she's got a disorder and he would help her to teach her brain how to separate these ghost images from the real thing. Sydney gets angry and tells Paul how he could help her if he doesn't believe her. Then Sydney leaves alone. She then comes to the hotel and gets in the elevator. But she sees a man levitating on a corner of the elevator and facing backward. When she checks the security camera on the elevator, she sees nothing there. Then a couple gets in the elevator, but she waits there. When she opens the elevator again, there is no one this time, and she enters the elevator and it goes up. But then suddenly she sees the man's reflection on the elevator. He's standing right behind her facing backwards. Sydney gets so afraid and reminds herself that this is not real and tries to open the elevator. Then the man slowly comes to her and we see his face is crushed. The elevator's door opens and Sydney takes the stairs and runs through the hallway. Suddenly the boy wearing the raincoat appears in front of her and he asks her repeatedly about the report card. Sydney angrily says no to him. Then he is seen standing at the hotel window and jumps below from the window. Sydney tries to save him, breaks the window, and looks down. But she sees no one down there. She walks to her room and behind her, the boy again appears and follows her. She runs to the room and locks the door. She then angrily breaks all the lamps and lights in her room and closes the window curtains. Helen tries to talk to Sydney, but Sydney doesn't answer her calls. So Helen sends Paul to check on her. Sydney is sleeping on her bed and covers her eyes with a cloth. Paul lights up the room and takes her to the hospital because Sydney's got some cuts on her hands during the breaking of the window glass. That night, Sydney is sleeping on the hospital bed and hears Alicia's voice. Alicia is standing in front of her bed. Alicia says to Sydney that her golf ball has gone and she has to go. Sydney follows her. Sydney sees the shadow entity again with Alicia and takes Alicia's soul away. Sydney runs to her, but then Alicia and the shadow entity disappear. Sydney feels sad and sits in the hallway and cries. The next morning, Helen comes to the hospital and gives Alicia's photo album to Sydney. Because Alicia is no more and Alicia's mother wants Sydney to keep the album. At this point, Sydney's vision is clear now. When she looks at the photo that she took with Alicia, Sydney asks Helen who this is, pointing to herself in the photo. Helen tells her that that's her. Then Sydney tells Helen that that's not her. Sydney goes to the mirror and looks at the mirror and also sees herself in the photo. Now here comes a big twist. We see a different woman in Sydney's reflection in the mirror. Sydney gets so shocked. Sydney then searches for some scientific research and finds out about cellular memory. It explains how the cells of the donor can remember and retain information to the recipient. Then she goes to Paul and tells him about cellular memory. She gives some real case examples of patients with liver and heart transplants. But Paul says it is evident with the major organs and corneas are not a major organ. But Sydney says that there could be a chance. She needs to find the donor. Paul says it's confidential information and if he does that, he could lose his license. Sydney gets angry and leaves the hospital. In the next scene, Sydney and Helen take the elevator to the hotel and Sydney gets afraid because of the previous incident in the elevator. So she checks the security camera first before entering the elevator. After seeing no one on the camera, she enters the elevator. Then a woman also enters the elevator with them. When the woman leaves the elevator, Sydney sees the boy again behind that woman. Sydney gets afraid and the woman understands something and says to Sydney that he's here, isn't he? My Tommy. This means she is the mother of that boy and he dies. In the next scene, Sydney is taking a shower. After that she goes to the mirror and talks to that girl in her reflection. Sydney asks the girl who she is, and what she wants. Then the girl opens her eyes and lets Sydney see a vision of the same incident of people dying on fire. Then Sydney breaks the glass with anger. From the other room, Helen asks if everything is okay. Then Sydney says that she has to find who the donor was. Because her eyes are now Sydney's eyes and she wants to see Sydney something. Sydney knows that it won't stop until she finds out who she is. The next day, Sydney goes to Country General in a taxi and then Paul stops her. He says that the donor was from Mexico and he would take her there. They go to Mexico. On their way, Paul tells her about the donor. Her name was Anna, and her mother is alive now and she worked in a ceramics factory. They get to the destination but suddenly Sydney sees a vision of a man on fire hitting their car. Sydney tells Paul to stop the car. Their car stops in front of a burnt place. They go inside that burnt place. They see some boys playing inside. They go to them and ask a boy what happened to this place. The boy tells them that it was a fire and the doors were locked and nobody could get out. He says something about a witch. Then they find Anna's house and go inside. They see the word, bruja, written on the walls. Sydney asks Paul what does that mean. Paul says it means witch. Sydney then tells Paul that she saw this place in her vision. They knock on the door and a man opens the door and says he works there. They ask if someone lives from Anna's family in the house. Then the man says Anna's mother lives here. She is sick and resting now. Then Anna's mother calls them in. Sydney and Paul introduce themselves. Anna's mother says what they want. They say that they want to talk to her daughter, Anna. Sydney says she has a connection with Anna. Then Anna's mother says that she worked in a factory and there was a fire and a lot of people died. Her face is also burned from that fire. She says if they had listened to Anna, they would have been saved. Sydney asks if Anna sees things that aren't real. Then her mother says she had a connection to the spiritual world and she could see death. When she was a little girl, she would sit in a person's house and cry, and soon after somebody in that house would die. People blamed her as a witch. Then suddenly Sydney sees the shadow in the house and tells Paul to call an ambulance. Soon after that, Anna's mother falls to the ground. She's having a heart attack. She chokes and says to Sydney that Anna repeats her death every night because she didn't get peace. Anna's mother requests Sydney to save her. Paul takes Anna's mother to the hospital but Sydney stays there. Sydney goes to the Anna's room and sits on her bed. Sydney tries to contact Anna's soul and says what she wants Sydney to see. Then Sydney sees a vision of people dying on fire in her past. Sydney sees inside a factory where a lot of workers are working there. Then Anna comes to that factory afraid and anxious and tells her father that they have to leave now. Then Anna sees a couple of shadows inside. Anna's mother is working there as well and Anna calls her mother to save her. But her father doesn't listen to Anna and gets her out and locks the door from outside. Then the fire inside the factory blows up and everybody inside is killed in that fire because they couldn't get out. People call Anna a witch outside and Anna takes her life in her house. Then Sydney wakes up and she finds herself sleeping in Anna's bed. She hears a sound. She goes to check it out. She sees the basement door opened by someone. She opens the door and goes to the basement. In the basement, Anna is there and tries to hang herself with a rope. Sydney sees Anna hanging and tries to save her. Sydney manages to get Anna down but Anna becomes unconscious. Sydney lets Anna rest in her lap and tells Anna that her mother wants Sydney to save her. Sydney asks Anna what she wants from her. Sydney says to Anna that she believes her and it was not her fault. Sydney forgives Anna. Then Anna dies in peace in Sydney's lap. Then Paul comes to the basement and sees Sydney sitting and crying alone, giving a hug to someone. Then Sydney and Paul leave there and sit in the car. Sydney asks Paul about Anna's mother. Paul says she is no more. On their way back to their home, they are stopped by traffic congestion. They get to know that a police chase down is happening on the American side of the border and therefore they close the whole border. Then Sydney sees a girl in her vision. She goes to her and touches the car window. Then she sees a vision of the girl trapped inside the car on fire. Sydney had seen this vision many times before. Suddenly she sees the shadows there going to a bus. She runs to the bus and enters to the bus. Then behind the bus, she sees a truck with a gas tank. Sydney now understands that there will be an accident and Anna lets her see this vision repeatedly to save the people in that accident so that Sydney won't end up like Anna. Then Sydney sees the shadows everywhere on the bus. Sydney and Paul tell everyone on the bus to get off by saying that there is a bomb inside the bus. Sydney and Paul take everyone from that area to a safe place. Then the car that the police are chasing crosses and hits the barrier in the border and hits that tanker. The tank gets crushed and the gas leaks. It ignites the fire and the whole truck catches fire immediately. The little girl is still trapped inside the car. Her mom goes to check the situation and gets hit by the people rushing through the road. She became unconscious. Paul breaks the window of the car and gets the girl out. Then Paul picks up her mom and the four get back to a safer place. Soon after that, the tank explodes, and the other cars explode one by one after that. They quickly sit behind a car to make the car a shield to protect themselves from the fire. But then the fragments of the glass of that car broken during the explosion enter the eyes of Sydney and she falls to the ground. Then the scene changes, and we see Sydney is taken to the hospital. Her face and eyes are injured during the accident. Paul says to her that she saved them. In the next scene, Sydney is playing in the concert but she goes blind again. She seems more focused and happy now with her condition. Paul and her sister Helen are also present there. She is grateful that the gift of Anna's sight and vision made her save herself and a lot of others and also gave Anna the peace she never found in her life. Sydney says they both shared a blessing and a curse. After her violin plays, she gets a standing ovation from the audience. The movie ends here. This was the story of the movie called The Eye. If you like the video, please subscribe to the channel. You will get this type of interesting story of the movies in the future. Thanks for watching.